Hello, fellow explorers! For the sixth time ever, welcome to Story Spelunking. I'm Sierra.
And I'm Stephanie. Today we'll be delving into the 2016 movie Hacksaw Ridge. And in particular, we wanted to explore this film as it sheds light on the Congressional Medal of Honor. Since this episode is about to fall around March 25th, which is National Medal of Honor Day, we wanted to kind of highlight not only Desmond Doss's story, but also the medal itself.
Now, unlike our previous explorations of media, this movie is rated R. It's rated R for portraying the violence of war, which I think is important for us to look at in all of its ugliness. However, if you have young eyes in your house, this movie's probably not for them. However, this exploration is for everyone.
Exactly, yes. And as far as war films go, I do think this one is like it's rated R simply for the violence. And so there's not an excessive amount of swearing or other things that, cause movies to be rated R.
The content overall is pretty family friendly. Unfortunately, the nature of war is just very violent. And while it is important for us to look at, maybe you don't want to put these images in the mind of a little kid. Maybe even a middle schooler.
Especially warfare in the Pacific was extremely brutal in many ways, and this film does not shy away from showing it. But another reason we wanted to look into this film as it really fits into my background as a historian. I study World War II. Most of the time, it's on the Eastern Front of World War II with Finland in World War II. But some of my first forays into research was on the Medal of Honor. And in fact, the first conference that I presented at, I presented on the Medal of Honor. And then my second conference, which Sierra also attended, where she got to hear the presentation on the Medal of Honor. So it's been really fun for me to also share some of this research that I had done in school on the podcast.
I came to Hacksaw Ridge as a movie not with the Medal of Honor in mind because I did not know that it had ever been awarded to a conscientious objector, which is an awesome fact. I came to watch this movie in very strange circumstances. I was on a friend's trip with my brother, friend of the show bestie Abigail, her two sisters, Alden and Anna-Kate, and their fellas. And my brother's truck, his pickup truck had broken down. So the menfolk were all fixing the pickup truck in the middle of the day, and the girls were like, what movie are us girlies gonna watch? We settled on watching Hacksaw Ridge, which is their Meemaw's favorite movie. An unlikely choice for Meemaw's and girlies, but it turned out to be really fun.
Yeah, I can't imagine my grandmother watching this movie.
And when I say fun, I don't mean the content of the movie is fun. I meant that it was fun to consume this movie with besties. Just a little girl's morning of watching World War II. Like that's your ideal. I feel like that's your ideal girls' morning.
Yes, I've watched many films, war movies, and usually it was with just my dad, and my sister and my mom would be off doing something, and we would always watch a war movie. But I think this movie does, in a similar way to what we've talked about with previous historical-based movies, it does serve as an access point into revealing the history of the Medal of Honor, which is our nation's highest medal for valor. So it's the most rare and prestigious medal awarded in the world. I would argue the only other medal that comes close to it would be the Victoria Cross in UK. And since it was established during the period of the American Civil War, only 3,528 service members have been awarded it. And that's a very, very small number when you consider that over 40 million people have served in the U.S. Armed Forces since the Civil War. So I think this movie is a great way to introduce you to not only Desmond as a Medal of Honor recipient, but also the other 3,000 recipients.
I'm coming at this movie from more of a narrative, a literature, an English perspective, as I'm not as well informed, and I think no one is on the Medal of Honor as you are.
Thank you. Maybe the National Medal of Honor Museum, which is about to open in Arlington, Texas. Maybe they should hire me.
They should definitely hire you. This is a ringing endorsement from me, who they care nothing about my opinion, but I'm giving it nonetheless.
I greatly appreciate it. Yes, thank you. And if anyone knows anyone at the museum.
Hacksaw Ridge, from a narrative perspective, brought to mind an ethical struggle that I've been thinking a lot about. As you will tell as we go on in this podcast, I have recently finished the book All Quiet on the Western Front. And the struggle I really find with books like All Quiet on the Western Front and movies like Hacksaw Ridge is that there is an ethical struggle between us using war and human suffering as entertainment, which inevitably movies and books, fictional and otherwise, like we're reading them for entertainment. Outside of school, if you're doing it for school, you're doing it for school. But if you're doing it on your own time, Hacksaw Ridge is entertainment to us, which poses an ethical question. However, these stories need to be told, and they need to be told through narrative because that's the best way for non-combatants like myself to understand what these men went through. There's a quote that's commonly attributed to Stalin, and that is, "One death is a tragedy. A million is a statistic." It's hard to wrap our brains around a million people dying, but if we can put it in a narrative form, then that gives us a little better chance to understand because we can rationalize, we can have compassion for seeing a story through one person's eyes.
Exactly. I spent most of today actually reading and researching about war, and I was translating a primary source book from a Finnish pilot. And it's so easy just to read a number and just move on from it. I found, and this will actually tie right back to your quote from Stalin. It's estimated that from when he came to power until his death, he was responsible for the deaths of nearly 40 million people. And to put that number in perspective, the wartime population of Great Britain was 36 million. So, in essence, Stalin killed the entire population of the United Kingdom.
I think that's where we can sometimes get lost in historical sauce in a bad way, is it can be easy to start viewing people as numbers when we are only ever just looking at dates and troops and numbers. Whereas if we bring a little bit of literature into history, some literary history, if you will, that really humanizes these people, which I think this movie does a great job of. To add a little more to the literary nature of this movie, the narrative, there are essentially two ways that horrific tragedies, especially wars, can be told from a person's perspective. Authors like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who witnessed the 1928 banana massacre in Colombia by United Fruit Company as a little boy, and Kurt Vonnegut, who was a prisoner of war in Dresden during the fire bombings, used magical realism and fantasy to share the experiences that they had because there was no way for them to put into straightforward words the horrors that they had seen. Whereas Eric Maria Remarque, who wrote All Quiet on the Western Front and fought on the Western Front during World War I, stated blatantly and straightforwardly all of the grisly and gross details of his experiences. And I think Hacksaw Ridge falls more into the second category.
I would definitely agree. And All Quiet on the Western Front is arguably one of the greatest anti war novels ever written, and I would highly recommend reading it, though I'm not sure if I read it at the ripe age of 13, which I don't know if I would recommend someone of that age reading it, because he, just like Sierra said, does not shy away from the true horrors of war.
I do not think I would have been able to handle that book at 13. However, I think that Hacksaw Ridge contains a lot of very similar themes and delves into a lot of the same sort of details in a way that's more age appropriate, I would argue, for a 13-year-old. Not saying it was inappropriate for you, but saying, like, thinking about the average 13-year-old, Hacksaw Ridge is probably far more approachable than All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of that has to do with the central figure of Hacksaw Ridge and how inspiring his life story is. Not to say that the main character of Paul and All Quiet on the Western Front isn't, but I think there is a level of, I'm not sure what the right word is in Desmond, that he seems a little less cynical, hopeful. Yeah, his heroism, I think, makes this movie, like you said, a little bit more accessible than All Quiet on the Western Front. And it definitely has a more hopeful ending, not to give any spoilers for All Quiet on the Western Front, because you definitely need to read it without spoilers.
I definitely recommend reading All Quiet on the Western Front without speaking in hyperbole. I think it was a life-changing read and audiobook experience for me, much like Hacksaw Ridge.
I loved going back and watching this movie because it is definitely in the top 10 for me of war movies. And the movie opens with some of the sequences from being on Hacksaw Ridge. Like we said, this is rated R for war violence. But then it goes back in time, and we actually spend nearly the next half of the movie with Desmond before he goes off to war. And I think that is why this movie works so well, is because you spend time you get to see who he is before he is thrown into arguably the worst moments of his life.
I think this is an aspect of any good war story or any story that deals with tragedy, and it's important for all of the authors that I've named before that we humanize in order to understand the tragedy that we will see unfold, that we know the people as individual people. And I don't think anyone sets up the complexity of people quite like Desmond's dad.
Yeah, and I really, this is another aspect of the movie that I really appreciate is because his father is a World War One veteran who is suffering from, well, they wouldn't have called it this at the time, but he is suffering from PTSD. And I think in the general scope of telling, retelling American history, World War One is largely forgotten because yes, we were American troops were not in combat as long in World War One, but that's not to say we didn't suffer huge losses. So American troops were in combat during World War One from May of 1918 until November of 1918. And in that period of time, 128,000 Americans died, which obviously it pales in comparison to what the other allies suffered who have been fighting in the wars for 4 years at that point. But just to put that number in perspective, like again, when we're talking about statistics, more Americans were killed in that short period in World War One than the 10-year conflict of the Vietnam War. So I really appreciate this movie taking the time to highlight the trauma that many World War One soldiers, once they came back from the front, and mind you too, World War One was not very popular in the American on the home front. And his father is visiting the graves of his fellow comrades, and he says this statement, "It's like I died with you."
Every time it showed his father and him dealing with the shell shock, as they might have called it, of World War One, it reminded me of All Quiet on the Western Front. And this beginning scene where he's talking to the graves of his fallen comrades called this quote to my mind. I am young. I am 20 years old. Yet I know nothing of life but despair, death, fear, infatuous superficiality cast over an abyss of sorrow. I see how peoples are set against one another, and in silence, unknowingly, foolishly, obediently, innocently slay one another. I see that the keenest brains of the world invent weapons and words to make it yet more refined and enduring. And all men of my age, here and over there, throughout the whole world, see these things. All my generation is experiencing these things with me. That's why it's
Yeah.
called the lost generation, is because the generation of Desmond's father was sort of lost to history. So many of them died in war. They didn't have words for their experiences. They came back different than they left, and people didn't know how to deal with that. They didn't know how to deal with it.
I appreciate them showing this because they easily could have skipped parts of this. And then we also see a key point, a key turning point in Desmond's life.
Desmond and his brother are wrestling and fighting on the ground as siblings and especially little boys have want to do. And his dad, who at this point in his life is an alcoholic, is just sort of telling them how to fight better because he doesn't know how to deal with them. And Desmond rolls out from under where his brother is punching him and grabs a brick and hits his brother in the head with a brick.
Yeah, a very like in the heat of the moment. And then shout out too to the child actors who play the young brothers because you immediately see in the kid's face he realizes what he's done. Like he's taken this too far. His brother ends up being okay, but he walks into his parents' room, Desmond does, and he sees this poster on the wall, which in an interview with the real Desmond Doss, he describes this, so this is accurate, and it has the 10 commandments on it. In this poster, you see for the commandment, thou shalt not kill, it shows Cain killing Abel. And this is the first step in really driving home the conviction that Desmond will later hold throughout his whole life of avoiding violence and not killing.
Then we go along with Desmond's life and we're sort of establishing who he is as a character by these various scenes. He's fixing the stained glass window in the church. He rescues a man who a car falls on, and he winds up at the hospital.
We should mention this. He was born in Lynchburg, Virginia, which is a town that we went to school in. And thankfully, I never had to go into the Lynchburg hospital. But this is a classic boy meets girl moment.
It's that slow-mo turnaround romance moment that you see in My Happy Marriage.
That I roll my eyes at.
But I bet you like to hear.
I mean, it's mostly because Andrew Garfield is adorable in this movie.
He is so cute in the 1940s clothes, and I told everyone with ears, including you, this, that I think we should all dress more like it's the 1940s.
As long as we keep the fabric though that we have now. I have my great grandfather's Navy uniform, and it's wool and it's super itchy. And a lot of the clothes back then would have been pretty itchy, and I don't do well with itchy clothes.
I can have the natural fibers with the modern processes. How about that as a compromise?
Okay, yeah, yeah.
But he immediately falls in love at first sight, and he offers to give blood as a way to talk to her. And I gave blood this week, so Andrew, maybe we have a connection.
Yeah, you're both just saving lives.
Heroes, really.
Yep.
Not to overuse the word. The romance in this movie is so good. It's not the point of the movie, but it is an important aspect of it and another thing that develops his character. And a great thing about his character that adds a lot to the romance is he's just so straightforward.
When he gets all kind of dressed up to go back to the hospital the next day, and she's like, well, you can't donate again because you literally donated yesterday. And I can't remember the line exactly. It's pretty corny, and she even admits it's corny.
It's so good. And it just establishes a lot about his character. I think character development, aside from the fact that this is a real story, but character development is one of the best aspects of this movie.
I think this love story too, along with we'll talk about a character later on who brings some levity, because you do need some moments of reprieve because there are a few truly heartbreaking scenes that are needed and that propel the story further. One particular scene that happens shortly after is Desmond's brother comes home in uniform. And this is where I think this is probably one of the best performances of Hugo Weaving's career. Hugo Weaving plays Desmond Doss's father, and he's mostly known for his roles in Lord of the Rings and Red Skull and Marvel. But this movie really showcases his abilities as an actor.
He should have won tons of awards for this, and I'm not sure that he was even nominated. He certainly wasn't nominated for an Oscar, which he should have been for Best Supporting Actor, because obviously, as we've established, he's dealing with a lot of PTSD, and it's specifically triggered by the military uniforms. So when Desmond's brother Hal comes in his uniform because he's off to join the military, the way that his lower lip quivers when he's looking at him, and then he goes into the story about his friend and his new uniform. It's honestly heartbreaking and incredibly believable. It shows us, it doesn't tell us that the dad has PTSD.
Then the story moves on because he ends up basically just leaving the room. And this is a moment that the movie kind of plays around with the real story. It kind of makes it seem that Desmond volunteered, but in actuality he was drafted, though he could get a deferment. So it is kind of in line with, while technically not accurate, it's within the same spirit of what happened. And narratively speaking, it makes it sound better.
More of a gray area than an outright falsehood.
Yeah. But then his father meets Desmond in the cemetery where his comrades are buried, and they have a really good heart-to-heart conversation. One line really stuck out to me. He tells his son that if you survive, you won't be giving no thanks to God.
Faith is such an important part of this movie and Desmond's character arc and the real Desmond Doss in real life. Everyone tells him that he is going to lose his faith, that he is going to lose his driving motivation when he goes off and sees war. But his is not a character arc that goes like that turns his back on his driving force.
Yeah, and I really appreciate, again, that the filmmakers, Mel Gibson is the director of this movie, they don't shy away from Desmond's faith. Like, it is front and center, just like it was front and center to Desmond as a real person. You really can't ignore the role faith played, not only throughout his life, but also in his actual act of heroism that he earns the Medal of Honor for.
So he joins as a medic.
In Fort Jackson, which is a real place, and I've been by there, because it's also in Virginia.
One aspect that comes up here that we have not yet mentioned is that Desmond is essentially a pacifist, which is why he joins as a medic. Because of his experiences growing up, he does not want to take the life of another person. In the graveyard, his father, the reason that he tells him he won't be thanking God is he says that other people can just move on and get over things, but Desmond won't be able to because he's thoughtful and faithful, and he thinks about things and he cares about people. But that's also why Desmond wants to go and be a medic.
Yeah, and specifically his past, he believes that he should not even touch a gun. And so in his mind, he should be able to train as a medic because you don't need a gun to be a medic. But inevitably when he goes through basic training, even medics had to qualify on marksmanships. We go into when he's in basic training, and then we are introduced to a whole new cast of characters.
This is a moment that is so fun. It adds the levity that we need. We're kind of seeing the whole of a human life and not just the desolation of war, like in All Quiet on the Western Front. There's hope. And the hope outside of romance is friendship and camaraderie among his unit, who is full of characters, and a performance from Vince Vaughn that I would argue is one of his best.
Well, in some ways, his character is very similar to some of the other characters he's played. Kind of serves as a comedic relief in a way, but he also has depth of character that we see later on, especially. But in essence, we meet Desmond's unit and he comes up with nicknames for everyone. And I think it also is really cool to see the diversity within the unit, which is absolutely accurate historically, that you have Americans from all walks of life coming together and serving in various units. He comes up with some fairly clever nicknames of various members of the unit, from this poor guy who does kind of look like a ghoul.
I am so sorry to this man because that is his real life face. He looks like a ghoul. and they wrote that in the script and he really looks like that.
Yeah, and then there's this one guy who is completely naked. I mean,
He
they don't
lost
show
his
it.
apparel by choice.
They don't show anything. So they nickname him Hollywood because this guy clearly thinks he is, the epitome of handsome. When Sergeant, played by Vince Vaughn, makes them all run out and start their training, he doesn't give him time to get his uniform on. And so they're doing this obstacle course and they have to dive through, mud and belly crawl underneath barbed wire. And this one line just made me laugh so hard. Vince Vaughn's character says, "I bet you're enjoying this, you naked degenerate."
It helps us catch on to who all of these people are so early in the movie.
Yeah. And Doss's nickname is Private Cornstalk, which
He's
is
so skinny and tall.
Which is, again, Andrew Garfield is a great cast for Desmond because he does also fit him physically.
He also brings almost a level of childlike innocence, even though he's not. And we see this a little further on. That is just so good for this character.
Yeah, and then inevitably they reach the part of the training in which they have to learn how to handle a rifle, and Doss refuses to pick one up, so he defies a direct order, which obviously is a court-martial offense. He meets with the captain of the unit, played by Sam Worthington, and he asks him, well, Doss had assumed that he would be able to become a medic without having to touch a rifle, and the captain's like, well, you're a conscientious objector, and Doss's response is, I prefer conscientious cooperator, which is a term that Doss himself actually did come up with.
That's such a good zinger, as well as being profound in a lot of senses, because there is no better description for him and what he did.
Exactly. And it is very interesting too to see, you get kind of a glimpse into military life as well. So they initially tried to have him declared basically insane and get him what's called a Section 8 discharge. The conversation between him and the psychiatrist is really interesting and very clever dialogue that also, besides really good character development that you don't usually see in a lot of war movies, also the dialogue in this film, there's several conversations that are truly compelling.
These whole scenes where he's going through the court process with the military called to mind a quote by Scottish reformer John Knox: "Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God." This mission that he's on to join the military is not from Uncle Sam. This is his calling on his life from God. And even though there are temptations all along the way to give up, he never surrenders his calling.
Yeah, and then he does get arrested because, he did defy a direct order, and so he's placed under arrest. His character is also relatable because he does struggle with this decision.
He has a meltdown, not a meltdown, a freak out in the prison, which this is the first time he really shows anger, and it just does such a good job of humanizing him, because prior some of the guys in his unit had beaten him up in the night because they're trying to get him to leave because they're like, as a unit, we don't want someone who's not going to fight. Their motives are understandable if their behavior is not respectable. The higher ups are actually encouraging them to do this because everyone wants him to leave of his own volition. They don't really want to court martial him.
Yeah.
So he has put up with so much. He refused to tell who beat him up. He just swallowed it, which garnered a lot of respect from the men in his unit. So when he finally breaks in this prison scene, it shows us that he's not a holy man. He's just a man, and he's truly struggling with this decision. It's not easy.
Several other people meet him while he's in his cell, including the captain, and then Dorothy, I guess we haven't mentioned her, she's his fiance and eventually wife, who try to kind of talk him out of it to a certain extent. Like,
it's very much Job's friends.
Yeah, that's a great example. Because the captain says, I'm a Christian too. There's a difference between killing in war and murder. And then Dorothy asks him, well, who are you going to save in prison?
And it's not that their points are incorrect theologically or rationally or morally, but he has made a covenant with God, which supersedes even his wife. After all of his Job's friends come to the prison and try to convince him to plead guilty and just be kicked out of the military, he prays about it, he has a night, and to the shock of everyone in the court-martial trial, he pleads not guilty.
Yeah, and then comes one of my favorite scenes in the movie. His father reconnects with one of his old buddies, who is now a general, and intervenes in the court-martial in uniform.
Uniforms were basically his dad's biggest PTSD trigger, and before, he would rather his son, who's about to ship off to war, leave the table rather than look at the military uniform. But he puts his old World War I military uniform on to go to the trial to save his son.
Yeah, it's truly an incredible moment, and the nerd in me was like checking out his World War I uniform, which is historically accurate, and the medals that he has with the Silver Star or World War I Victory Medal, and then the French medal that I'm going to say in its English name, Legion of Merit. It's definitely one of my favorite moments of the film when Desmond is defending himself because he's getting court-martialed for disobeying a direct order, so he actually is guilty of that. But then he explains that while everyone else will be taking life, I'm going to be saving it.
It's also like, it's your life. I understand logistically. You want every person there to be able to fight because you might need them to do multiple things. However, I mean, outside of provisioning them, I don't see how having more medics could be a bad thing. It's his life.
They eventually rule that due to his constitutional rights, you can't force him to violate his rights. And the general preceding the trial tells him, he said, Private Doss, you are free to run into the hellfire of battle without a single weapon to protect yourself.
And this is the turning point in the movie because it's almost like two movies put into one. You have the first half of the movie, which is the home front and dealing with the military and his status as a conscientious cooperator and his father's legacy in overcoming PTSD to get the letter from the general that saves him from the court-martial and marrying his wife. And then it's wartime, in truth.
Yeah, we arrive on Okinawa, which actually isn't Desmond Doss's first experience with combat, but again, there's time constraints in a movie. I think overall this movie does a really good job of balancing somewhat, I would call, I've kind of used the term Hollywoodized violence. There are some moments in the film that are a bit dramatized, but then contrast that to when they're making their way to the line and they are passing the unit that they are relieving, and you see what has become known as the 1,000-yard stare on some of the soldiers who are coming off the lines, and you see the complete contrast between Doss's unit, who are fresh, and the unit that just came off Hacksaw Ridge. And that really captures just the horror of what these soldiers experienced on that ridge.
Another movie that I think does this sort of Hollywoodized violence for the purpose of showing us the true horrors of war is 1917. I think this is a little bit reminiscent of 1917, although I believe it came out after Hacksaw Ridge did. And we have a history with 1917, which we will have to explore another day.
Yes, definitely. I couldn't help but noticing there are just so many moments in this movie that just made me very happy as a World War II historian. And I'm just going to briefly just mention just a few of them. Like you see some of the civilian population on Okinawa, which there was a significant civilian population, and sadly, so many of them got caught in the crossfires between the US forces and the Japanese forces. Over 150,000 civilians died on Okinawa, and you can see some of that. There are some elements too that people may be wondering whether or not that's historically accurate. Yes, Japanese soldiers did target medics. So the moment when Doss is advised to take all of his Red Cross gear off is absolutely true. And also why medics on the Pacific theater carried guns, whereas medics in the Western theater did not carry guns in compliance with the rules of war. And there's other moments too when you see the naval bombardment, the battleships start to fire on the ridge, and you see their 18-inch naval guns. And I came across this trivia fact years ago, and I just love to drop it on people. The weight of a shell of an 18-inch naval gun weighs the same as a Volkswagen Beetle. So they just imagine in your head they're literally shelling the Japanese position with Volkswagen Beetles.
That makes it much more unsurprising that so many civilians were caught in the crossfire.
And then this movie also does a great job showing, while the bombardment is very visually, you see a lot, it actually was quite ineffective. And you see that as soon as the soldiers actually get up on the ridge and the Japanese positions are fine. Because the Japanese had been on this island for years. They had been fortifying it for years. So there are literally miles and miles of network tunnels that they had prepared. And so many of the pillboxes were basically invisible from the air or even from the ground. They were so well camouflaged and built into the actual terrain of the island. And then once the soldiers actually get on top of the ridge, although the movie does exaggerate the height of Hacksaw Ridge a little bit, they still had to use those like rope ladder system thing.
It was
And
like
even
a
the way,
siege ladder.
yeah, the way that they climb the ropes is also accurate, because normally when you're climbing a ladder, you grab the horizontal line, but soldiers were taught to grab the vertical lines so that their hands would not be stepped on by the soldiers above them. So it's just like small things like that. Like no one's gonna really notice that unless you're, a nerd. But they got those details right.
It shows a level of care for the subject matter that, as I mentioned in the Anastasia episode, I think the level of care and respect makes a big difference to making a historical movie.
Exactly. And then the tactics you see the soldiers use is also accurate. They're going to try to flank these Japanese positions because you never want to attack head on. And when the sergeant, Vince Vaughn's character, calls in for the heavy fire team to take out this pillbox, you see different members of Doss's unit leapfrogging from basically these craters that have been filled by the bombardment, and then bringing up satchel charges and throwing those within the aperture where the Japanese machine gun was sticking out. And then I'll stop in 1 second, but also the weapons that they're using are all accurate from the Smitty, which we haven't really mentioned him yet, but we will get to him in a moment. He's using a BAR, which is a Browning automatic rifle. Vaughn's character has a grease gun, which my grandfather carried, and he absolutely hated because it was very cheap, but you could mass produce it, so hence why they had so many of them. And then the captain with his M1 carbine. Yeah, I love the way so much of this film is historically accurate.
I really didn't know that much about purse warfare before I saw this movie, but there it is.
Yeah, obviously, some people might be surprised at the use of the flamethrowers, which were not used in the Western theater, but were used very much so in the Pacific theater. And you see some of the first instances of napalm being used, and that was in the Pacific theater on these island hopping.
I noticed a lot more references to, not references, but precursors to Vietnam than I had the first time.
Exactly, yeah. You're seeing glimpses of some of the evolution warfare, but also in some ways the de-evolution of warfare, and the fact that the tactics I mentioned about taking out these fortifications and pillboxes was extremely painstakingly slow and costly. Didn't matter how many Volkswagens you threw at it. It's going to take small unit tactics, working pillbox by pillbox, clearing them. And sometimes various Army and Marine Corps units would actually have to go back because of these tunnel networks. So pillboxes they thought they had cleared, the Japanese would go back in, coming at it from a different tunnel. Absolutely, you see what we see on Okinawa and other islands in the Pacific is what we're going to see in the jungles of Vietnam.
It's like the modernization of timeless guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, exactly.
Another element of this part that for someone I can't tell you much about the historical accuracies, but what I can tell you about is some cinematography. I think they use the cinematography to great effect in this movie, and you can really notice it on the way the shots are in the first charge versus the second charge, which comes later. In this initial charge on Hacksaw Ridge, there's a lot of long shots focusing on the goriness because it's meant to shock you about how futile this feels to them. There's already been charges. They keep going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It feels so hopeless. And the shots, the long shots on the fighting really show this. But when the second charge happens, the shots are different because you're supposed to feel more hopeful at this point, but what's going on is still really upsetting and gory. But they choose not to focus on that by focusing on the shells leaving the guns and what the Japanese are doing in the tunnels, which we'll get more into later. So they choose to focus on these small details rather than the outright gore the second time. But they focus on the gore the first time, so we feel the same level of shock that the
Yeah.
soldiers do when they first reach the ridge.
Yeah, and I also appreciated their very limited use of shaky cam.
I hate shaky cam.
Same.
Much like with the lighting. I want to see what's going on. I don't want to be nauseous.
Exactly.
Another thing about the cinematic shots that really sticks out is that you can really see the shininess of the wedding rings on a lot of the characters against the dirtiness of their skin. Even the extras are wearing wedding rings. So even the characters that we don't know anything about have their own stories, and the costuming helps establish that.
Exactly. And then we get to one of my other favorite moments in the film, and it's actually a moment of reprieve. They have successfully, at least they think they have, successfully captured the ridge. We'll see that's not the case momentarily, but Doss and one of the other members of his unit, which we haven't mentioned much, but we'll go into him now, Smitty, they have this conversation as they share a foxhole together.
I love Smitty. He may be my favorite character in the movie. It's just the way his character grows from being Desmond's number one hater to being his number one supporter. Like Desmond stays out late into the night after they think they've taken the ridge, dragging the wounded back, and someone has to go with him because he's not carrying a weapon. And Smitty is the one who goes and stays with him.
Yeah, and he, when you first meet him in the barracks, he's pretty antagonistic towards Doss, and they kind of have this rivalry at the beginning. Though you do see some glimpses that Smitty may be more complicated than he initially is giving off. Like, he doesn't participate in the moments when Doss is beaten up by the other members of his unit. But it's really in the conversations he has with Doss in this foxhole. They both kind of share their backgrounds, and Smitty explains that he didn't really know either of his parents. He was dropped off at this orphanage, and he says this to Doss: "I learned how to hate quick. I learned how to judge people quicker, and I got you very wrong."
Smitty is one of those great characters who the world has made really hard and bitter on the outside, but on the inside, he's actually very, not loving, but he's loyal. Like, once he's with Doss, he's with Doss. He's hard on the outside, very lovable on the inside. They've gotten to the point where they're ragging on one another because what else are you going to do in a foxhole overnight, sleeping on this ridge? And so he's messing with him about his wife, and he calls him crazy. And Desmond says, "I never claimed to be sane." However, he in fact did, to the psychiatrist. That's neither here nor there. They're sharing about their background, like you mentioned. And he actually shares a lot about his dad that we've never clearly seen up to this point. Like, we know his dad was physically abusive to his mom and to them, but we didn't quite know the extent. He had a nightmare that alluded to it. We see a scene when he's a little boy where he hears his parents downstairs. But we flash back to the scene when he's telling it to Smitty, where Desmond's dad had a gun and he's beating his mom, but we actually kind of don't know what he was going to do with the gun, whether it was for his mom or for himself. But Desmond takes the gun from him defending his mom and points it at his dad like he's going to shoot him. And we learn that this is why he has the covenant with God about not touching guns, because he almost killed his father. It's again very Cain and Abel, except with his father. And Smitty says, like, you didn't kill him though. And he says he killed his dad in his heart. The Bible tells us that hate in your heart is murder, which is what Desmond is referencing.
They put his faith, they give it the proper time to develop, and you see it. And then they go back to joking back and forth, and Smitty's like, "Well, you sure you don't want a gun?" And then, Doss says, "No." And then He says, "Well, I'm not giving you mine because you're crazy." And it's truly a great scene. It also gives you a chance to kind of breathe after you witness this insane sequence, and it's about to go back to being absolutely crazy when the Japanese launch a bonsai charge.
And even though there are so many characters in this movie, moments like this with Smitty and with his unit as a whole, you get to know these characters to an extent, even though you don't really deeply know them because you just don't have time.
Yeah,
Which makes what
exactly.
comes next all the worse.
So the Japanese launch a counterattack, and the American forces are pushed off the ridge. And I don't know, should we do spoilers?
Absolutely. Or this deep in.
Smitty is shot several times, and the sequence is so hard to watch.
This is the scene where if I had ever watched this movie at a normal time that wasn't mid-morning, I would be bawling my eyes out.
Yeah.
Smitty is this hardened character who's so angry at the world and bitter but loving on the inside. And when he's done, he looks at Desmond and says, "I'm scared."
Yeah. Also such a humanizing moment because those are his last words. And Doss carries him and he gives him morphine and he carries him to the end of the cliff, and he's like, "Hey, we need to get this guy down now immediately." And the other medic's like, "He's gone." And Nick says, "You need to move on." So many of the men are now trapped on the ridge because the captain called in for fire support, and this is the moment where Desmond makes one of the most important choices of his life.
They're retreating, but the retreat is bad. Most people are trapped because we're now shooting into our own guys. I said we're like I was there. I am America. And he could easily flee and save his own life. But he really lives by this principle. 1 John 3:16. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. What makes him such a good medic is the reason that they didn't want him to go over there at all. He said, "I'm staying up here. I need to save as many men as possible."
Yeah, and he audibly prays, "Lord, what should I do?" And what answers him are the moans from his fellow comrades who are wounded. And so he sees that as the answer, and he starts to rescue them one by one.
And he says this line that is a quote from the real life Desmond Doss. As he's going, he continually said, "Please, Lord, help me get one more."
Yeah, and this scene is incredible, not obviously because of this is true, this is what Doss did, but also just the way it's filmed. And then we have to bring in the score at some point. The score for this movie is composed by Rupert Grenson Williams. The track that is playing during this sequence is literally called Praying, and the score builds, and it's these violins playing the main theme, and it's truly incredible. What he did is a miracle because he shouldn't physically have been able to rescue as many men as he did. To this day, we don't actually know how many for sure he rescued. He was a very modest man, and he always downplayed his own heroism, but he rescued at least 75 men, if not probably upwards to 150 men.
It's crazy to think about because, again, with the numbers, we can just say 75 men, and that alone is crazy enough to think about. But you have to put these men in the context of they were providers for their families. They may have supported their parents. They had loved ones back home. He brought 75 men at least down the ridge who represented someone else's entire world, their son, their brother, their cousin, their husband, their father.
Exactly. And it's truly incredible. And you kind of already mentioned it, but his superiors and others doubted his ability to be a medic because of his convictions. But those arguably made him a better medic and made him be willing to risk his life to save all of these men who without him would have died.
He saved men who had court-martialed him, who beat him up in his room. The very thing that they doubted him for, his conviction and his faith, is the very thing that saves them in the end. Desmond Doss saw people as valuable because he believed they were valuable as individuals made in the image of God. He wasn't coming from numbers. He saw them as important just because they were people, and the Bible teaches that people are valuable to God, so they ought to be valuable to us. That is why he stayed up on that ridge when everyone else retreated. It didn't make logical sense, but it made biblical sense. He was willing to lay down his own life to save these other people, and it winds up not even just being his fellow American soldiers. He winds up in the tunnels because the Japanese are still coming after him. Anyone who they see moving, they're killing. So he winds up going in the tunnels, and there's grossness with rats eating corpses, but he finds a wounded Japanese Japanese man. And instead of killing him, he gives him first aid, and the man doesn't shout out to get him killed. He just accepts the aid. And he even sends some wounded Japanese soldiers down the ridge later. And this scene in the tunnels reminded me of a scene in All Quiet on the Western Front, of course, where Paul, who's the main character, is in a foxhole with a French soldier. Paul is German, and they're fighting, and he, to save his own life, immediately attacks the man and wins. However, the man doesn't die immediately, and they're stuck in this foxhole overnight. And this is the quote: "The silence spreads. I talk and must talk. So I speak to him and say to him, 'Comrade, I did not want to kill you. If you jumped in here again, I would not do it. If you would be sensible too. But you were only an idea to me before, an abstraction that lived in my mind and called forth its appropriate response. It was the abstraction that I stabbed, but now, for the first time, I see you are a man like me. I thought of your hand grenades, of your bayonet, of your rifle. Now I see your wife and your face and our fellowship. Forgive me, comrade. We always see it too late. Why do they never tell us that you are poor devils like us, that your mothers are just as anxious as ours, and that we have the same fear of death, and the same dying, and the same agony?' Much like Paul giving first aid to this French soldier after he attacked him, Desmond gives first aid and life-saving relief to these Japanese soldiers in spite of being on opposite sides, although he does not attack them. However, some of them, when they make it down the ridge, one of the soldiers says they didn't make it alive to the hospital.
Yeah, because that is obviously what happens in war is you dehumanize your enemy, because if you see them as a fellow human, then you're not going to be able to, in theory, be able to kill them. But that's what separates Doss from others and enables him to save them. He eventually rescues the sergeant. There's a funny line where, again, we need a little bit of levity because there are some very, very tense moments when he's rescuing these soldiers and hiding from the Japanese. There's a sniper sequence, and Vaughn tells him, "You're like gum on a shoe," when he's, rescuing him.
But just like the things before that they hated in him, he loves that about him now.
Yeah, exactly. And eventually Doss comes off the ridge. But then, of course, they're going to have to take the ridge. If you understand the Battle of Okinawa and where Hacksaw Ridge is located on the islands, you can't control the islands without controlling Hacksaw Ridge, which is a series of ridges. So that's why they had to attack it head on, because you couldn't go around it. And so they make this second attack, and it's actually on the Sabbath day, which brings up an interesting point.
Before we get there, there is that great, slightly cliche, but I still love it, movie moment where all the wounded men are arriving to the camp, and the captain looks out, or someone runs up to the captain and says, "Captain, you gotta see this."
Oh, yeah, that is true. I think that also kind of brings, like, there obviously are moments that they do dramatize for the sake of the story, but as a whole, I would argue this is a pretty accurate description of World War II in the Pacific.
They're also amazed by what he's done, though, that it reinvigorates them for that second charge, because they see the miracle for what it is.
Yeah, and the captain tells Doss in particular, he says, like, a lot of the guys don't, really have faith necessarily in God, but they have faith in Doss's faith in God, which is an interesting way to look at how one person's beliefs can affect a whole group of people.
It's the first baby steps of discipleship.
But then we do get the sequence where they go and retake Hacksaw Ridge, and like Sierra already mentioned, the way that this is shot is completely different. And then of course we have the score, and this is the kind of slow-mo that I prefer more of rather than the, romantic slow-mo. But this is an incredible sequence where, because of how it's shot and the music, you have a completely different feeling as you watch it.
That score, if I could have a score moment of my own, is just so good. The drum beats are staccatoing in time with their heartbeats as they run. It's incredible, and it puts you in just the right headspace for what's going on.
Desmond is wounded pretty severely in this final charge, and he does it because he saves the captain from a grenade. The movie ends with him being lowered via stretcher off the cliff. And then I think they also did a really good job bringing the audience right back to the fact that this is a true story.
The way that the movie ends is with these clips of interviews and real life pictures with text telling us about what happened afterwards. And it's so moving to see these people we've just seen acted out in real life. There's a clip of the captain who he saved, and he's still crying, and he's elderly by this point.
Yeah. We should mention the captain's real name is Jack Glover.
I'm sorry, Mr. Glover, I could not recall your name. What this movie does so well is with the characters. To tie up Desmond's story, much like Mio in My Happy Marriage, his character arc is not that all of these horrible things he's lived through have made him bitter and angry. It's that he's gone through these things and remained kind and faithful to God and kept his covenant.
I also think this movie is very interesting, and they're really, I mean, you could argue, obviously, the Japanese are the villains, but they're not really portrayed as villains. They are also, just like with that passage you read from All Quiet on the Western Front, the Japanese soldiers are humans as well, and some of them, yes, had been brutalized by the Bushido Code, but they also are humans too, and were made to fight these wars.
Essentially, it comes down to all of these soldiers on every side are just going at the direction of someone they have no control over for interests that may not necessarily be their own.
Exactly. So I don't know if there's really any true villains in this movie besides those who started the war.
I completely agree. I think it does a good job of, you can't really hate anyone. There's antagonists, there's an opposing side, but in the end of the day, they're all just men.
And I think that kind of brings us, as we wrap up, to we started talking about the heroism of Desmond Doss, and that kind of brings me, to this question of what is a hero? And if I may have my own minor soapbox moment,
Take it away.
I get very frustrated at how flippantly we use the word hero. People talk about, this heroic move in sports or celebrities or whatever. And I really try not to ever use the word hero to describe those types of actions, but rather a hero is someone who places others before themselves and is willing to risk their own life or their own happiness or risk something for someone else. And I thought this was really interesting. In an interview with Mel Gibson, he said that this film really isn't a war film, but rather it's a love story, because it's love that drove Doss. Love of his fellow soldiers, love of his fellow Americans, love of his family, love of his wife. And Gibson actually quoted John 15:13, which says, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." I am off my soapbox.
I think that the respect they gave to these real people who deserved it is what drives this movie to be so great. You can feel the care and the love and admiration they had for this man, and they couldn't even put all of the details in the story into it because it would have felt unbelievable. That's how miraculous his faith was, his actions.
Exactly. And I think it's also a great way to learn more about the Medal of Honor, which Doss was awarded shortly following the end of World War II. This goes straight into my further readings. There is a book that I have about Desmond Doss called The Unlikeliest of Heroes by Booton Herndon. I haven't actually read the book. I randomly found it in a thrift store in Lynchburg, and it's signed by Desmond Doss.
That's an incredible find.
I know, I have a good record of finding autographed books at thrift stores. If you want to learn more about the Medal of Honor, there's a book called Beyond Glory, The Medal of Honor Heroes in Their Own Words, compiled by Larry Smit. And then there's one massive book that I highly recommend actually getting the book. It's called The Medal of Honor, A History of Service Above and Beyond. It's put together by the Congressional Medal of Honor Society, which you can go to their website, and they have all of the citations for every single Medal of Honor recipient, along with the timeline of how the Medal of Honor came to be. It's a great website and a great resource, along with the National Medal of Honor Museum, which also has a website and is opening really soon. There's a Netflix documentary called The Medal of Honor, which I highly recommend. They dramatize some of the sequences, so it's not just interviews or whatever. They actually dramatize some of the actions that merited the Medal of Honor. And then if you want a book on more recent recipients, there's one by Dwight Zimmerman titled Uncommon Valor, The Medal of Honor and the Warriors Who Earned It in Afghanistan and Iraq.
My further reading is not quite as thorough, although I recommend, if you're interested in the Medal of Honor, or not, to go read Stephanie's recommendations. Mine, unsurprisingly first, is All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Maria Remarque. I would recommend trying the audiobook. It was very well narrated, it was very good, and I recommend audiobooks for a lot of your classics, especially if you're not too into reading classics or you're slightly intimidated. Audiobook is the way to go. I listened to this one and I was walking around my neighborhood openly crying. And on the topic of World War I, you might as well go watch 1917.
Yes.
Then, on more of a World War II aspect, I Recommend Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. As I mentioned, Kurt Vonnegut was a World War II veteran. However, he put his experiences in Dresden, surviving the firebombing in a slaughterhouse, into more of a fantastical element. I am very fond of Mr. Vonnegut's writing. Recommend him for everyone. And finally, I recommend The Girls of Atomic City, the untold story of the women who helped win World War II by Denise Kiernan. It gives you a perspective of women on the home front and the type of work they did, even on the atomic bomb. And this happened right here in Tennessee, where I live. So close to home, home front.
And then, we'll have to join us for our next episode.
Join us for a different sort of battle, a battle of adaptations, a battle of sisters, a battle of Little Women. Who comes out on top, 1995 or 2019? The answer will not surprise you.